Good morning and welcome to the In Defense of Christians Capitol Hill Advocacy Day, Day 2 of the IDC National Summit 2021. It's our honor to have you join us today. My name is Richard Gazelle, Executive Director at In Defense of Christians. We have an exciting program prepared for you today. Today's events will kick off with 2 expert discussion panels. The first one will kick off right now at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, and will focus on saving Lebanon as the last free bastion of Christianity in the Middle East and its challenges and way ahead. The second panel discussion will begin at 10 a.m. Eastern Time and will focus on Turkey, Ottoman fantasies, and geostrategic realities, particularly its persecution of Christians domestically and across international borders. During the panel discussion, I encourage you, our audience, both live and virtual, to have your questions ready for Q&A portion of the program. Those joining us virtually can submit their questions in a YouTube live comments section, which we'll be monitoring throughout the program this morning. Following the conclusion of our panel discussions at 12 noon Eastern Time, all participants will gather into their pre-assigned groups for congressional advocacy meetings. We're pleased to report that IDC has secured advocacy meetings with upwards of 50 congressional offices for you, our close sponsors, supporters, and advocates. So without further ado, let's jump right in. As most of you know, for the last 2 years, Lebanon has been experiencing one of the worst economic crises in recent centuries. The economic crisis has now triggered a humanitarian crisis, further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the August 4th, 2020 explosion at the port of Beirut. What's worse, Hezbollah's stranglehold on Lebanese affairs vis-a-vis Iran has kept Lebanon on the brink of civil war and regional war for the last 4 decades, and enables the endemic government corruption we witness today. With us today to discuss the many facets of this issue, we have Bishop Gregory Mansour, the Eparch of the Maronite Catholic Eparchy of St. Maron of Brooklyn; Andrew Doran, co-founder of In Defense of Christians and a senior research fellow at the Federalism Project; Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, joining us on Zoom, veteran U.S. diplomat and current vice president of the Middle East Media Institute Memory TV; and of course, last but certainly not least, Namat Frem, resigned member of Lebanese Parliament. And joining us also via Zoom from Lebanon is Dr. Habib Malik, professor at the Lebanese American University and senior research fellow at the Federalism Project. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Bishop Gregory, I'd like to start with you. Could you please talk to us about the role of Christianity, and particularly the Christian community in Lebanon, and the future challenges to Christianity in Lebanon?
Okay, it's a big topic. So I would like to see Lebanon as one of those rare nations that was formed by a Christian-Muslim intentionality. And I mean, which makes Lebanon a little bit different from all the other countries in the world. In the United States was created with an intention of a religiously free people, because you had people from all over the world who established the United States, and the first right is for religious freedom. And I think the same thing is true of Lebanon. Lebanon was created intentionally when Patriarch Hawaii, at the age of 76, traveled to Versailles to urge Allied leaders to carve out a nation that would be a refuge for Christians and Muslims. And he went there in a delegation of Christians and Muslims with the intention that Lebanon would have borders that would include Shiite, Sunni, Druze, and Christian. It bothers the heck out of me when I see anybody, including groups of people or individuals, who think that Lebanon should be just like any other nation. The majority rules and the Christian minority is not important, and et cetera, et cetera. So for me, Lebanon was created on purpose with a mission. And John Paul II said it very clearly in the 90s when he said, Lebanon is more than a country, it's a mission. And therefore, Christians and Muslims have an equal buy-in to that reality. And I can say this about some Christians, and I can say this about some Muslims. They think that history is not important, or the ideas of people in the creation of Lebanon are not important. And I beg to differ with them, whoever they are. And so I think that the role of Christians, the role of Lebanon in the world is so important, and it's worth not fighting and killing people for, but it's worth fighting to defend that identity of Lebanon.
Thank you, Bishop Mansour. Next, I'd like to go over to Andrew. Andrew, we understand you were just recently in Lebanon, spent some time on the ground there. Of course, the crisis in Lebanon has been very well known to you and many of us for years. But having just been there on the ground and spent some time there, your observations and study, what did you bring back with you?
Thank you, Rich. I think the first thing, like any traveler to a foreign country, you approach the question with a sense of humility. Lebanon can't really easily be understood by outsiders. I think there are dimensions to it that simply cannot be understood by outsiders. And so you spend years asking questions, listening, observing, thinking, asking more questions, trying to understand, and still you find these dimensions of Lebanon that are simply beyond comprehension. At the same time, outsiders can, I think, oftentimes offer perspectives and a little bit of objectivity and maybe a different angle on things. And so while I approach the question with humility, I nonetheless have some strong feelings on the subject. Two critical points that I think bear treatment. The first is that, after years of doing this in policymaking and advocacy, in some ways as a freelance journalist and traveling around the country and speaking with so many different Lebanese and people from the Middle East, one does begin to form some opinions. But we used to liken Lebanon to a complex physics equation, on a chalkboard. And you're looking at it, and one piece of data is off, or one part of one part of the problem is a little bit off, and it throws everything off. But you hear people say very often, well, Hezbollah is not the only problem. I think I would say that I understand that perspective, but that it is the sine qua non. It is the one problem that Iran's hegemony over parts of Lebanon, both geographically and institutionally. This is the one thing that if it is not addressed somehow, the other problems simply cannot be fixed. And I think that they are able to maintain power more or less for two interrelated and complex reasons. The first is the resistance narrative. Now, we've seen for the better part of 75 years that scapegoating isn't something that's new in the last 75 years, but the scapegoating of minorities, the scapegoating of foreigners, scapegoating America, scapegoating others. This has been more or less a governing tactic throughout the Middle East, and everywhere that it's been tried, it has failed. And so what we saw with the Abraham Accords last year, I think, was the trend that will continue in the region where there is success, and where that is not, some version of that is not tried, at least some sort of peace, stability, something beyond like a temporary armistice. This is ultimately the path to peace and prosperity and stability. So anything that pokes a hole in the not just the resistance narrative, but the governing through fear and terror and the constant threat and the ideology. Just a quick word on the ideology. The Khomeinist Hezbollah ideology. I was thinking of a story I heard from Mart Laar, the former Prime Minister of Estonia years ago, who grew up in communist controlled Estonia. And he was going to get his PhD, and someone told him, well, you have to be a member of the Communist Party. And he said, well, I don't believe any of that. And And he said, and the professor said to him, Mark, that's okay. Nobody has believed any of that for years. And so he enrolled in the Communist Party and got his PhD. In other words, everyone was sort of going through the motions of the ideology, but nobody believed it anymore. One gets the sense of that across the Middle East. When people are talking about the current crisis in Lebanon and its complex problems, its origins come from within Lebanon, and the parts that come from outside Lebanon come into Lebanon to subvert Lebanon's own interests and priorities. And they've been invited in from the inside. So Hezbollah has created a shadow military, a shadow government, a shadow economy, and they have learned how to benefit from every weakening of one of those institutions. So every time there is a failure of governance in Lebanon, every time the financial system or the economy is weakened, with every weakening of any sort of governing institution, they benefit. And so I think at some point there has to be an understanding that Hezbollah has essentially seceded from the Lebanon project. They have their own Lebanon. It's not a state within a state. They've effectively seceded. And so the question is, how does the rest of Lebanon, those portions of Lebanon that wish to be free, how do they unite under some sort of decentralized model and thereby put pressure on Iran and Hezbollah? Because Iran and Hezbollah want to drag the rest of Lebanon down. They benefit from this. They benefit from the exodus of Christians and other minorities. They benefit from the destruction of Lebanon's governing institutions. There's a reason that they're always trying to be photographed with the Lebanese armed forces, because they know that that will be used in Washington to defund the Lebanese armed forces. These are not foolish people. But they don't know how to lead. They don't know how to govern. All they know how to do is ultimately destroy. And this gets back to the first point, which is all of this is going to end in rubble and destruction. And whether it's people who were duped into ideology by fear or irretrievable stupidity or whatever it may be, it all ends the same way. And that's think Berlin 1945. If I may quickly, what are the steps that should be taken? I would say whether it's on a college campus or in the media or in policy-making rooms, I think confront the resistance myth in Lebanon. I think that's very important, because this is a very weak myth that can be taken apart. Secondly, when you see people who have the courage, whether it's the patriarch or the bishops or Druze villagers who stood up to Hezbollah, refused to be used as human shields, and had the courage to stand up. And we all saw those videos, and we saw how frightened those Hezbollah operatives were. Suddenly the tables turned in a matter of seconds because of the courage of those Druze villagers. That may be the model by which all of this comes crumbling down. It may be something very simple. It may be fragile. People say, well, they have 150,000 rockets. That's true. But I actually think they are more fragile than many people believe. I think that governance reforms ought to be instituted that lead to that isolation of Hezbollah. The Lebanese ought to be able to choose between a free Lebanon and a Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon. And then the last point I would just add quickly is that I would love to be able to say that the West is going to help, that America is going to help. Much of the history of Christianity in the Near East consists of Christians waiting, like those defending the walls of Constantinople, for help to come from the West that never comes. I don't think America is going to show up with a white paper that is going to solve Lebanon's problems. I don't think the West is going to show up and solve Lebanon's problems. And I understand that we're here, we're in Washington, and we are advocating for several specific things. And those are worth advocating for. But in the end, U.S. power in the Middle East is ultimately going to be limited. What the West can do in the Middle East is limited. And priorities are unfortunately going to be elsewhere. So in the end, the burden is going to fall with the people of Lebanon And I don't say that in a cold way. I say that because I simply believe it. There are many more complicated issues, but the Lebanese Civil War is the war that the Christians lost twice, because they not only lost the Civil War, but then were handed over to 15 years of Syrian occupation. My government had no small role in that. There are other instances of that. And so as we look at the news today, we look at grand bargains for peace being developed in the region. I'm sure many Lebanese are watching and wondering if they are once again going to be left to the wolves. So with that, I'll pass it over. You asked a very simple question and I gave too long a response, but thank you.
Never too long, Andrew. Thank you so much for that. And I certainly agree. The founding myth, the narrative that Hezbollah has really propelled itself forward with is indeed a house built on sand. So it's important to capitalize on that fact. Thank you. Shifting over to Ambassador Fernandez. Ambassador, of course, we know you very well as an outspoken critic of Hezbollah for many years. My question for you, Ambassador, how do you view U.S. policy on Hezbollah? We know that it's not effective. I don't think that's really up for debate. But what can be done? Is it something that the U.S. government, in your opinion, is taking seriously? And what would you like them to know if you had their ear for a day?
Thank you for that. It's a challenge. I agree with you certainly that I think U.S. policy towards Hezbollah has been schizophrenic. Somehow I got muted. I don't know.
We got you, Ambassador. We got you.
Okay. Yes, I think, U.S. foreign policy towards Hezbollah has been schizophrenic, even in the best of times. And unfortunately, this has been a bipartisan schizophrenia, which existed even, for example, in the Trump administration, which was strongly against Iran and ostensibly strongly against Hezbollah. I mean, the problem is basically that we live in Washington this fiction that the subversion and occupation and dominance of the Lebanese state by Hezbollah is something which can be ignored or finessed. By Washington, and that somehow we can separate the Lebanese reality from the reality of Iranian aggression in the region. Now, what I think Washington should do when it comes to Hezbollah and when it comes to Lebanon, I would say there's a couple of things. First of all, I want to say that ideally, a solution for Lebanon, unfortunately, which doesn't seem to be on the table, would be to have a Lebanon which was much more decentralized, which was much more federalized, where power was returned to local authorities, where you could really see where good governance functioned and where poor governance failed. Because I agree with Andrew that Hezbollah, in the end, really can't govern. It is a parasite on the Lebanese state, which is taking over and eating that parasite. Ideally, what should happen in Lebanon, obviously, is Hezbollah should be overthrown. It should be defeated. It should be crushed. That's not going to happen absent violence, and obviously, we don't need violence in Lebanon. In the United States, the U.S. doesn't have the ability, nor the foreign policy power, nor the attention to bring that about. And U.S. foreign policy track record on removing states and trying to change states and regimes, certainly in the last few years, has not been a very positive one. I think the U.S. needs to focus on several things. Number one, we need to look at Lebanese elections that are coming up in 2022. And even though I think expectations should be extremely low and realistic in Washington, the West needs to work to, at the very least, help those who are truly opposed to Hezbollah and its sectarian frontmen. both on the parliamentary level and later on when there's an election, or there should be a selection of a new president. Again, the expectation, I think, is quite low. I think Washington needs to work in this area. The second thing which needs to happen is there needs to be a more grassroots effort to empower Lebanese outside the state and these organs and party institutions which are controlled by Hezbollah, to kind of create a parallel society or a counterculture away from the tentacles of officialdom that would be a step in the right direction. I hesitate to mention him because he's my friend and he was murdered, but in a way what we need is more what Luqman Salim, that martyr of Lebanese freedom, who was murdered by, most likely by Hezbollah earlier this year, what he did, which is bringing together grassroots activists, business leaders, independents, anti-Hezbollah energy together and building these kind of grassroots networks. That needs to happen among Lebanese Shia, people who are opposed to Hezbollah, who are independent, who have independent voices. And it also needs to happen among non-Shia, because one of the things that gives Hezbollah its power today, especially today, is the Christian cover that is given by certain political parties and certain politicians that basically make the Hezbollah project much more successful, much more encompassing than it would be. So I think that type of grassroots building and independent building very much on the local level among Lebanese Christians is essential. If we don't do that, what's going to happen very soon is the population of Lebanon, the Christian political representation in Lebanon, will be exactly as it is, for example, in Iraq. As you know, in Iraq, there are parliamentary seats for Christians. The Christians that are chosen for these parliamentary seats in Iraq are not chosen by the Christians of Iraq. They're chosen by Shia political parties, very much like Hezbollah, or Kurdish political parties. They're tokens. They're basically front men for somebody else's political project. So those are the three things that I would focus on: blunting the Hezbollah and its agents' agenda in the Lebanese elections, building on the grassroots level, both on the Shia side and on the Christian side. And on the Christian side, to basically decouple Mar Mikhail and other types of arrangements between Christians who somehow think that Hezbollah is the way to go, which actually are destroying the community and destroying the future of not just Lebanese Christians, but of an independent and a unique Lebanon that is different than the other countries of the region.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that. I'd like to shift over at this time to Mr. Fran. Now, as many of you know, Mr. Fran is a resigned member of Lebanese Parliament, resigned shortly after the August 2020 explosion at the port of Beirut, which is attributed to government corruption and complicity in that tragic event. Nemat Efrem, in our opinion, at IDC, is one of the few truly reform-minded members of Parliament, former members of Parliament. So I'd like to pose the question to you, Nemat. After 13 months of there being no government in Lebanon, one was recently announced about 2 weeks ago. Your thoughts?
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to comment what I've heard from the three speakers. Really, they complement the picture, and now I think the view is a bit clearer. So what we have today is a new government. I don't want to shoot from the beginning and say that it's going to be the same thing a different day, and it's going to be in kicking the can. So I would say, let's wait and give it a chance for 2 months, really 2 months, to see how, first, this government will deal with the IMF, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Will they know how to take structural decisions that are not necessarily popular decisions for the next election, that will help Lebanon go back to track. Two, they will know how to deal with the decision-making processes within the government vis-a-vis Hezbollah and others. And all of these will be very clear in the coming 2 months. Now, if I want to go back to really the problem of Lebanon, well, I guess what we are having is a situation which is very, very special after we have lost the war in 90. Somebody said it, I don't know who, probably Andrew. And after that, we could see how time, and with time, Lebanon is starting to be excavated from inside to such an extent that in 2019, it crumbled. This is really what was happening. 20 years of a termite-like work from inside to such an extent that it collapsed, but collapsed a multidimensional collapse, a political, administrative, economical, and social, all together. And since we are here in IDC, in defense of Christian, and we are talking about the last bastion of Christianity in the Middle East, I would say first, this is the last bastion of Christianity in the Holy Land. It's beyond the Middle East. This is the Holy Land. And we are talking about an exodus. I warned about it 2 years ago at IDC when I said it's more lethal, it's more effective to take out the Christians from the Middle East by having a failed state in Lebanon than by having persecution of Daesh. It's even more dangerous, more effective, not because it is going straight to every family. It's because also it's silent. It's a silent killer. What's happening now in the last 6 months, we haven't seen it in 20 years of civil war. When you see that you don't have Panadol, antibiotics in the pharmacies of Lebanon, when you cannot have oxygen in the hospitals, the Lebanese that are used to be living at $12,000 GDP per capita, surrounded by economies of $500 to $1,000 GDP per capita, they cannot accept to stay in an economy of $2,000 or $3,000 GDP per capita. It's as simple as that. And they are leaving. And in 3 years, we will be talking about 200,000 Christians in Lebanon. This is alarming. This will change forever Lebanon. As Bishop Mansour said, Lebanon was created for those pillars or constituents of Lebanon today, the families, the sectarian families, the Christians, the Muslims, the Druze, the Shia, and the Sunni. If the Lebanese, one of them disappear, like today the Christians, we will be talking about the raison d'être of Lebanon. And Lebanon will change forever. This is why we need to act now, and this is why we are talking about, we're having this session today. The problem is, and unlike with what's happening with Daesh in Iraq or in Syria, here we don't solve the problem with one-dimensional solution. It's more complicated because it's a social, economic, governmental, governance, and administrative problem. You need to deal with it in those 4 dimensions. This is why we think that the problem is a failed state problem because it has been excavated from inside and destroyed from inside, that we have to rebuild at those levels. This is why the solution needs to be addressed from how do we rebuild Lebanon governance, decision-making process, administration, all of these things together. Starting from one point, we need to have Lebanese that believes that Lebanon needs to go back to be a free, functioning, productive country. All of these together. Our objective should bring us back to the $12,000, $15,000, $20,000 GDP per capita. Otherwise, you cannot have Lebanese educated, successful, all of these Lebanese staying in Lebanon. This is why we have created, since I left Parliament, we have created a new movement. And we called it Project Homeland, Project Watan, because we felt that it's a new project. We have to rebuild it. From there, we decided that we need to answer 8 questions, 8 structural questions if you want to rebuild a functioning Lebanon. And I want to list them very quickly. The first one is, what do we mean by a civil state in Lebanon? Everybody's talking about a civil state. It's an oversimplification of things to say it's a normal secular democracy where everybody, where the majority takes it all, and then it doesn't work like this. We are talking about Lebanon, about the Middle East, where the religions, the monotheistic religions came on earth. This is a place where sectarianism is identity, is an identity issue. It's not going to church, it's beyond. So second is decentralization, extreme decentralization. How do we mean by it? How do we do it? 3, what do we mean by the national security of Lebanon? And 4, what is the ultimate electoral law? 5 is the independence of judiciary. 6 is the socio-economic identity of Lebanon. How free economy it is, how the economy is, how free it is, or how social it is. Because we have another problem coming with what's happening. The change of the DNA of Lebanon is being replaced by a Venezuelan-like today economy. Very similar. It can't be more similar than that today. And last but not least, the recovery plan from this collapse, economic collapse. So all of this, I don't want to continue further, but I tell you, we have to work very hard in this new election to have a plan to go to a functioning, free, productive Lebanon. Otherwise, there will be no more Lebanon that looks like us here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your insights are certainly valued. Shifting over to Professor Malik, my question for you, Professor. You're a prolific writer, specifically on the matter of federalism in Lebanon. Now, the issue of federalism is it's an idea that's shared somewhat widely, but not very frequently spoken, frankly and directly about. And there are also some misconceptions. Some folks tend to view federalism in Lebanon as this idea of balkanization of Lebanon, but we understand that's not exactly what it is. So could you please talk to us a bit about this idea of federalism in Lebanon, Professor?
Thank you, Rich, and I thank IDC for making my presence with you, audio presence, not video, possible today. Yeah, I'll say a few words about federalism, but I want to, in a sense, I regard the federal option, if you will, as Plan B, because right now I am taking quite seriously the upcoming elections next May, and it's pretty obvious that a grassroots opposition to this mafia militia cartel that has seized Lebanon, this grassroots opposition has emerged, and it went in large numbers into the streets starting in October 2019 to protest the defrauding of the Lebanese people, the decades of corruption and mismanagement, and the criminal politician warlords. Now, most of those protests, very large scale, were peaceful. Indeed, they were civilized, but they were met with violence and the use of escalating force by the authorities and those protecting them. This is a clear example of oppressors and oppressed. Lately, this same opposition has been organizing itself into a variety of populist groups with a view to challenging the powers that be of the cartel in next May's appointed parliamentary elections in Lebanon. And of course, sitting with us here is maybe the leading figure in this opposition, Mr. Namat Frem, who in a sense very briefly outlined some of his program, and I happen to know some of the details, and there's a lot of substance behind what we are going to be seeing during the upcoming elections. I agree with Ambassador Fernandez that we shouldn't have very high hopes for these elections because the cartel in charge has all sorts of tricks up its sleeve in terms of fraud and buying of votes, and of course, at the end, scuttling the elections altogether and creating a security pretext. But look, a great deal is at stake. Nothing less than the future of an entire generation of young Lebanese, Lebanon's own future. Lebanon is losing its youth to galloping emigration. And this will mean the end of Lebanon as we have known it, an oasis of personal and communal freedoms in an otherwise freedom-starved Middle East. Lebanon losing its Christian youth primarily, along with entire Christian families, packing and leaving permanently, will render Lebanon indistinguishable from its Arab surroundings in terms of the absence of basic freedoms and pluralist coexistence. Well, over the past several months, the criminal cartel has seen to it that the bare necessities of daily life, essential medications, electric power, gasoline, diesel oil, running water, the internet, have been reduced to near vanishing levels, thereby transforming people's lives into a daily hellish pursuit after scraps of these vital items, often with no results. How much longer will the punishment of an entire people persist as the rest of the world watches, or more likely averts its gaze? So what can realistically be done? And again, Rich, I'm still addressing the contours of Plan A. Plan B would be if the elections fail or don't happen or are scuttled, or then of course a federal option is the only viable one for any composite or heterogeneous society like that of Lebanon. Realistically, I think the opposition born of Lebanon's still pulsating civil society and spread across sectarian divides needs to be given a fighting chance to compete on as level a playing field as possible in the upcoming parliamentary elections next May. For this to happen, connections with this opposition by external powers friendly to Lebanon need to be strengthened, with tangible support and publicity being provided. On the spectrum of options available to friendly Western powers, the two opposite poles of this spectrum should be avoided. On one end, attempts at nation building, which under the best of circumstances tends to be a fool's errand. On the other hand, cutting and running, that is total abandonment, which is both shameful and unbecoming of American and the West's sustained, unique cultural, political, and geostrategic footprint in Lebanon after close to 2 centuries. A footprint that has brought countless benefits to both Lebanon and the wider Arab region. Smart and creative steps along the spectrum of options between these two toxic poles are what is required. Washington's policy planners can do better than to shrug cynically and say, let it fail, or these are tribes, they'll elect the same crooks, or give it to Syria, and so on. Specifically, helping to salvage what has positively distinguished Lebanon for decades, if not centuries, namely education grounded in free critical inquiry, first-class healthcare, a vibrant, largely successful mercantile culture premised on free enterprise, innovation, and private property ownership. These are the areas where the West has invested heavily in the past and must not abandon today. When America knew how to do benevolent empire, no land grabs or imperial colonial impositions as with other powers, the legacy and face of the principled American shone through and imprinted itself indelibly among generations of Lebanese and by extension Arabs. No reason to squander all of this now. The Lebanese can rebuild their own nation if the cartel monkey, especially the mafia component of it, is lifted off their backs. Serious and intricate election monitoring by the West and the international community's credible agencies needs to be undertaken, from the electoral law to ballot counting and everything in between. This will serve as a weapon in the face of irregularities or widespread electoral fraud at the hands of the cartel. Nullifying internationally counterfeit elections will deal a strong blow to the perpetrators. Slapping harsh, targeted sanctions on specific individuals and groups will bring about another blow. So far, not a single member of the criminal mafia in Lebanon has been brought to justice. What a deplorable stain. Creating an international fund under the stewardship of high-profile, morally impeccable individuals, a fund for Lebanon's and especially its Christian future generations, and publicizing it widely will inspire trust and confidence in potential donors, especially among the Lebanese diaspora, and help to stem the hemorrhage of emigration currently underway. Many families, particularly Christians, will have second thoughts about leaving if they can be reasonably assured that their children will be able to have access to affordable education and health care in the coming years. For the moment, in parallel with election support for the opposition, a squeeze on the mafia, continued support for the Lebanese army, and setting up the fund just mentioned, swift attention must be seriously given to providing relief on the level of the absent daily necessities that the suffering Lebanese people are deprived of. Better that this be done directly and not through mafia-infested government channels. Again, creative humanitarianism is required. Writing Lebanon off as a lost cause is way too premature and in fact self-defeating for the West. Bold, clever, and cost-free moves can be done to help alleviate the mounting pressures on Lebanese society and to create a viable opening for the opposition forces to assert themselves at the ballot box come next spring. Freedom is Lebanon's gift to the region. Do not forsake it. Now, again, we give this Plan A one last historic chance for the elections in May. If it doesn't work, I am an advocate of the federal option, as Ambassador Fernandez has outlined, and we can go into tremendous detail on that, but maybe at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that detailed answer. I'd like to now open it up for questions. We have a number of questions queued up from our virtual audience. But if anyone in our live audience has any questions, please raise your hand to be recognized. We have a microphone floating around. I think we have.
Hello? Oh. I just have a question. Israel has not come up, but is there any role for Israel to play in relationship to this future of Lebanon?
Thank you so much. And if you could just identify yourself for the audience and for the panel.
With Charisma Magazine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think this is a good one for you, Andrew. Any role in the future between Israel and Lebanon, outlook on normalization? We've seen Abraham Accords unfold over the last year. Unfortunately, none of them included Lebanon. Thoughts on that?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I actually, probably one of the few Americans who has a little bit of experience firsthand in both places in the last couple of months. And what really strikes me is that setting governments aside, there's immense fascination from people in each country and the other country, and I think a lot of misconceptions, which I find to be very interesting. And I would also say that the overwhelming majority of both people in both countries, I think, want peace. My sense, and obviously I can't speak for the Israelis, but my sense is that the Israelis are about as keen to send their young men and women in the military back into Lebanon as Americans are to send troops back into Afghanistan. That was their Afghanistan. They withdrew in 2000, and they've ceded everything except Sheba Farms. And so the rationale for military resistance that Hezbollah offered, with the exception of Sheba Farms, which is frankly complicated, probably Syria has the best claim to it, doesn't exist anymore, and yet they've continued a military buildup. So Israel looks to the north, and all they see is Hezbollah. So when you try to explain to Israelis that it's much more complicated, I think that they're a little bit, they're somewhat skeptical because they see a country that's more or less held hostage. At the same time, you saw during the terrible port blast, the Lebanese flag shown on buildings in Tel Aviv as a sign of goodwill. I think they would love nothing more than to have peace, but they've been burned so many times. I think their approach has been typically to hands off. They don't want to be involved. They will speak to anyone, but they don't want to be. They know that they are very easily a pretext for violence either against individuals or a military conflict. Having said that, they are very close to 150,000 rockets that are aimed at them, and that's a very difficult situation for them. So what role? I simply don't know. I suspect that they would welcome any sort of opportunity for creative diplomacy, but they're very pragmatic at the same time. So I don't know if that really answers your questions, but I think they would say, we don't want to be involved, we just want to be left alone. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Anyone else in the audience live? Yes, Elan.
Good morning, everyone. Great conversation. It's a question for the virtual friend, Alberto Fernandez. Ambassador, how are you? This is Alan Dargham. How are you, sir? So let's talk about the tools of sanctions. As we living in Lebanon, we witness that sanctions only serve the interests of Hezbollah instead of limit its activity or whatsoever. And we see the deterioration of the Lebanese economy. It's also serving Hezbollah that he create his own economy inside Lebanon. And we see this big shift between Trump's administration to Biden's. We see different interests in the region, different way of seeing how they're going to achieve the same goal probably. But the Biden administration, or the feeling that we sense in Lebanon, that he is not very interested in what's really going on in Lebanon. Maybe now we hear congressmen speaking greatly about Lebanon, but when it comes to real policies by the Biden administration, it's absent, completely absent now. What's your take on that?
Is that for me? Yes. Yeah. Look, I'm not a fan of Biden administration, so I'm not going to parse or try to present them in a good light. I think that the approach with Iran, which comes, the approach towards Iran, towards coming to some kind of deal with Iran, is going to benefit Hezbollah, and it's going to benefit all of Iran's proxies and allies and entities in the region. So I have very low expectations from the Biden administration when it comes to the region and to Lebanon, unfortunately. I would hope that some of the common sense things which have been said, like a focus on positive outcomes in the electoral process, understanding basically the as Dr. Habib calls it, the cartel and Hezbollah, which is part of that cartel, seeking to undermine Lebanese remaining political processes. We need to compete. I think there's a larger problem beyond the U.S., and that is the way that the West looks at Lebanon is flawed, in that Lebanon is important, Lebanon is unique, but all too often, foreigners, foreign states, including the United States, fall into the default of thinking that Lebanon is this, these corrupt state entities or these corrupt plutocrats that are there. And the country is not the same as these people who are looting it and robbing it. So I think that the West needs to have a kind of a deeper perspective when it has to Lebanon as a nation and as a people, engaging but being less naive in how they're doing it, and less naive when it comes to Hezbollah. I think there needs to be more sanctions on Lebanon, not on Lebanon, but in Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah stooges and enablers, particularly those who are not actually members of Hezbollah, but actually are people who give it cover, political cover, and economic cover. Magnitsky is something which needs to be used more in Lebanon. Of course, that is targeted. That is not on the Lebanese people as a whole. That's targeting corrupt individuals who are the ones, by the way, responsible for the disastrous situation which Lebanon finds itself today anyway.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Unfortunately, we've run up to the end of our time. What a wonderful discussion to have that could go on for hours. But I do have one last question that I'd like to pose for Bishop Gregory, and that has to do with Christian institutions in Lebanon. We know that for the last 100 years, Christian institutions, hospitals, schools have really been a backbone for Lebanon, not just the Christian community, but for the Lebanese state as a whole. Briefly, Bishop Gregory, could you just talk to us about the role they find themselves in today and what we can do to help?
Thank you, Rich, and thank you for this panel. Thank you for everyone for being here and those who are watching online. I cannot overemphasize how important Catholic institutions are in Lebanon. Without them, the government has been zero. And if you want to serve the poor in Lebanon, help the Catholic institutions, because they help Catholics, they help Orthodox, they help evangelicals, they help Shiite and Sunni and Druze. Now, with that, if I can just conclude with some thought. In human history, there has been 3 places in which Christians, Muslims, and Jews have thrived. Andalusian Spain, and that's history. Isfahan, Iran, and now that's history. Lebanon is left. The only place now on earth where there is a Christian-Muslim conviviality. That is why it bothers the heck out of me. This is my issue with Hezbollah, and my issue also with others, who doesn't buy in to the very history and identity of Lebanon. If you don't get Lebanon, it's just like any other place on earth, and just let it fall to the cartels. But if you get Lebanon, then you will conform yourself to that Lebanon that is part of history and that is part of a conviviality that might not be there tomorrow if you don't help the Catholic institutions of Lebanon, for instance, or if you don't diminish some of Hezbollah's arm on Hezbollah and Iran's arm on Lebanon, but also with Saudi Arabia. We don't want a Lebanon that looks like Saudi Arabia or looks like Iran. We want a Lebanon that looks like it was intended to be, and that is Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Bishop Mansour. And thank you to all of our panelists that are joining us today. And a special thanks to our participants, both live here in the audience, as well as those joining us virtually. This concludes our first panel. We'll take a brief intermission of about 5 minutes and resume with our second panel discussion to begin at about, we'll say about 10:10. But you're welcome to join us for some refreshments outside. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to
Good morning once again and welcome back. For those of you joining us just now for the first time, welcome to In Defense of Christians, Capitol Hill Advocacy Day, for our second panel discussion this morning, discussing Turkey's persecution of Christians. My name is Richard Gazelle, Executive Director at IDC. Once again, our team will be monitoring your questions throughout the discussion, so I encourage you to submit your questions in the YouTube Live comments section. As many of you know, in December of 2019, both houses of Congress passed a resolution recognizing the Armenian Christian genocide which took place between 1915 and 1923, perpetrated by the Ottoman Turks. It took the lives of 1.5 million Armenians and over 1.9 million Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, Aramaeans, and Maronites. In April of 2021, President Biden also recognized the Armenian genocide. But we must ask, how much has really changed in the last century? Any casual spectator of international affairs could easily recognize the concerning trends exhibited by the Turkish state, particularly under the Erdogan government since 2002. Turkey continues to persecute its final remaining Christians through overt acts of violence, and most notably through increasingly weaponized Turkish legal system. But Turkey's persecution of Christians extends even far beyond its international borders. With us today to discuss these alarming trends, we have Dr. Aykan Erdemir, Senior Director of the Turkey Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Aram Hamparyan, Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, Dr. Amy Austin Holmes, joining us via Zoom, Public Policy Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Andy Zemenides, also joining us on Zoom, Executive Director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Dr. Holmes, I'd like to start with you. IDC has closely followed your work concerning Turkey's kinetic aggression and occupation in northern Syria, particularly its impact on the final remaining Syriac and Assyrian communities. What are some recent developments and what is your outlook?
I'd like to thank the In Defense of Christians for hosting this summit today and for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there to join you in person. I'm particularly glad that we're actually joining together today to have this discussion because we are at a critical turning point for the Christian minority in the Middle East, in particular in Syria. We have now already in 2019, March of 2019, declared the victory over the territorial caliphate of ISIS. And although we won the war, we are at risk of losing the peace and losing essentially everything that we achieved since then if we do not address the myriad sources of instability in the region. And this includes not only the ISIS sleeper cells that continue to carry out attacks in northeast Syria and Iraq, as well as the instability caused by the Assad regime, Iranian-backed militias in Syria, but also the very serious and ongoing instability caused by the numerous Turkish military interventions in northern Syria. Now, the Turkish government is essentially engaging in an Arabization policy or a Turkification policy that will, if left unhindered, exceed in scale the Arabization policy of the Ba'athist regime that happened decades ago. Now, this Arabization and Turkification policy is happening in the areas that Turkey occupies in northern Syria because Turkey is using primarily Syrian Arab militias that many of whom espouse Islamist ideologies. So Turkey has essentially created a second military, in addition to its own military, a second army, which they're now calling a Syrian National Army. Now, in the past, some of these groups fought against the Assad regime as part of different Free Syrian Army brigades. However, now the main purpose of this Syrian National Army is not actually anymore to fight against the Assad regime, but rather Turkey is using them as proxies. They claim to target PKK, or what they perceive as PKK in Syria, but in reality what they are doing is trying to undermine the entire autonomous administration of North and East Syria, which governs approximately 1/3 of Syria in the areas that have been liberated from the Islamic State. And in order to undermine the autonomous administration of northeast Syria, Turkey and their proxies in this so-called Syrian National Army are targeting not only Kurds, but anyone who has any kind of affiliation with the autonomous administration, including Armenians, Assyrians, Syriac Christians, Yazidis, Arabs, Syrian Turkmen. And so if we look at sort of their policies as a whole in terms of targeting the civilian infrastructure, the power plants, for example, that civilians rely on for electricity, weaponizing the water supply that northeast Syria relies on for their water, it becomes clear that this has, actually nothing to do with an limited anti-PKK campaign, but it's really an attempt to undermine the entire region of northeast Syria, where some approximately 4 million people live. And so I think if we recognize the scale of what Erdogan is trying to do, it will be quite alarming, because we realize that the modicum of stability that's been achieved since the defeat of the Islamic State in 2019 is at risk. And so the Turkish operations are worrying for this entire region, but in particular for the religious minorities. There are a number of religious minorities, including Armenians, Assyrians, Syriac Christians, and Yazidis, who may not survive in their ancestral homelands. And I'm not exaggerating, but they may not survive unless we address the root causes of this instability and make it possible for those hundreds of thousands of people who fled from the interventions to be able to return to their homes. If we look at this also from a historical perspective, I think the longer term trends become clear. Turkey has once before annexed a province of Syria, the Hatay province as it's now known, or Liwa Iskenderuna as it was known in Syria back in 1939. At the time, in 1939, French colonial officials actually justified allowing this annexation to take place because they claimed that this would prevent further Turkish interventions in Syria. And so the interventions that happen now in 2018 in Afrin and then in 2019 in the area between Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, or Rish Aino as it's known in Arabic, or Sarikani in Kurdish, very similar dynamics played out because the proponents of those interventions, or those who said that this would be somehow appeasing Erdogan would allow Turkey to sort of have the stability they desire and allow them to have the so-called safe zone, as they were calling it, to protect their border. Proponents believed that this would, again, appease and calm down the situation. But instead, what we've seen is the opposite. We've seen a continuation of instability. And so Turkey has not achieved their own objectives, which they say they want in terms of protecting their border, achieving stability. But we've seen an ongoing insurgency now in some of these areas, and the mass displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. And so now, because we're speaking again from a longer term historical perspective, I think it's important to mention that one of these cities that now Turkey occupies and the Turkish-backed militias is Ras Al Ain. Ras Al Ain, or Rish Aino, was at the time of the Armenian genocide in 1915, 1916, the second deadliest site of the Armenian genocide inside Syria. An estimated 65,000 to 70,000 Armenians perished in Ras Al Ain alone. And it's believed that actually one of the reasons that Ras Al Ain was chosen as a site for these atrocities is precisely because it was a relatively remote location, distant from the embassies or consulates in Aleppo, for example, or Mosul or Damascus. And tragically, what we're seeing again today is that because of at the time of, again, 1915, 1916, it was chosen as a site for these atrocities because it was a relatively remote location. There were few foreign observers in the area. Again, today we're witnessing Turkish attempts to prevent any outside observers from visiting these areas, particularly now the most recent intervention between Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain. And so this is one reason why I think a congressional delegation would be important to visit these areas now occupied by Turkey and to report on the situation there. But in part because of this lack of access to the area, I have myself relied on data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Set, ACLED, to create data sets to provide an objective assessment and understanding of the nature of the conflict along the Syrian-Turkish border. And using ACLED, I went through thousands of cases of armed conflict recorded by ACLED because I took the Turkish claim seriously that they were threatened by the SDF or YPG on their southern border. I mean, that was their justification for the intervention. And so because I took this claim seriously, I took the trouble of going through thousands of events in ACLED. And I found that from January 2017, which is the first date for which they had data available, until August of 2020, there were 3,319 attacks by Turkey or Turkish-backed proxies against the SDF, YPG, or civilians, compared to 22 cross-border attacks from the SDF or YPG inside Syria into Turkey. And 10 of those 22 incidents we could not independently verify happened, and the 12 that we could verify in fact did in fact happen all took place after Turkey launched the intervention in October 2019. So they were in response to the intervention. So this ACLED data confirms internal assessments by the highest ranking US diplomat on the ground the entire time leading up to the intervention, Ambassador William Roebuck, who in an internal memo said that the Syrian side of the border was quiet for the year and a half leading up to the Turkish October 2019 intervention. And so to sum up, this Turkish intervention in October 2019, after the phone call between Erdogan and former President Trump, was essentially based on a lie. And so I think it would be important for the Biden administration to recognize this and to recognize that following the Turkish narrative has gotten us nowhere. It's led to mass displacement of civilians, including religious minorities, and that we need to instead rely on objective information in order to devise US policy to the region. And I'd just like to close by saying, when we talk about these huge numbers of people that have been displaced from the border because of the Turkish interventions, and the historical parallels from the time of the Armenian genocide, I think it's important to just remember that these are, actual families. They're not just statistics or numbers or historical, memories of these tragic events. But one Syriac Christian family who I spoke to recently fled in October 2019, but one member of the family stayed behind, trying to protect the property that the family owns in Rish Ain or Ras Al Ain. So they have a home in the city of Ras Al Ain and a farm outside in the countryside. And this uncle of theirs who stayed behind to try to protect the property so that they could eventually reclaim it when it would be safe to return, was, he had to get permission from the Turkish-backed militias to travel from their home in Ras Al Ain to the countryside. So, he had to get special permission from the militias. And then one day, some of the militias came to him and said that they wanted him to participate in essentially a propaganda video. So a propaganda video to show, look, there's a Christian who's still in Ras Al Ain, and to make a video about it to try to convince the world that things weren't that bad in Ras Al Ain, and there is in fact at least this one Christian who's still there. He knew that he couldn't refuse, and so he said he would do it the following day. And then he escaped that night because he did not want to take part in this propaganda video to try to whitewash the Turkish occupation of Ras Al Ain. And so he left, and now there's no one from the family who's left there to protect the property. And the Turkish-backed militias have in fact appropriated their property and enriched themselves from the homes that have been left empty by the Christians and Yazidis and Kurds and Arabs who fled because they do not want to live under the Turkish-backed militias in Ras Al Ain. And so I think it would be very important for the United States to ensure that it is possible for everyone who fled from these areas to return, to regain their property, to receive compensation for the property that was stolen or damaged, and that the U.S. actually needs to mediate this conflict, similar to other conflicts that have been, we found a peaceful resolution to, for example, between Egypt and Israel with the Camp David Accords, in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, that this conflict requires a serious U.S. effort to mediate that's in the national security interest of the United States, and the very survival of religious and ethnic minorities in Syria depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes, for that. I'd like to shift now our attention to a good friend, Aram. It was 1 year ago, just about 1 year ago, when Azerbaijan attacked Artsakh, a native, centuries-old Armenian homeland. And I think it's also proper to say Turkey attacked via Azerbaijan. So Aram, since that occurred 1 year ago, what has since unfolded, and how can the United States best respond via policy?
Okay. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Rich. Let me take a small step back. And when I say a small step back, just about 100 years, which for Armenians is just a recent history. To understand where we are today, Rich, and where we're heading, this is how I think about it anyway, right? About 100 years ago, when the Turkish Republic stood up, it seems to me anyway that the West, the U.S., Europe, and Kemalist Turkey came to some general understanding, and the understanding was something like, listen, the past is the past, we'll leave that behind, and what happens inside your borders, that's your business, but we expect you to be a reasonable regional partner, right? And that was like the basic deal. Help us on the regional stuff, and we won't remind you about the genocide you committed, and we won't really say much about the people that you mistreat inside your borders. And that deal stuck for a really long time. And when was the pivot exactly? It might have been the 2003 Iraq War. It might have been this April when Biden recognized the Armenian genocide, or 2019. Pick your pivot, doesn't matter, but things have pivoted. And they pivoted under Erdogan, and he's basically taken Turkey in a different direction. DC has been generally slow to catch up with that. So I think we're kind of in that environment where things have changed. Erdogan's perfectly happy with that. The U.S. is kind of two minds. You got a congressional mind, maybe an executive branch mind, some tensions and stuff. But it's pretty clear that the era of the blank check for Turkey, that's by and large over, which is good for us, right? Which means that the United States is reclaiming policy that was once outsourced to Ankara. So before, if you want to know U.S. policy on Cyprus, well, don't ask the U.S., ask Ankara, right? Same is true of the Kurds, same is true of the Armenian genocide. That era of they get to decide, they set the policy, they export it to D.C., we enforce it for them, that's over. So that means because the policy is being reclaimed, we enter the plane of politics. And that's good, because we live in the plane of politics. We're citizens, we get to vote, right? This is a place where we can make a difference. In that prior era, we were just observers, bitterly banging on the doors trying to make a difference. But now that we can make a difference, and the key to making that difference, right, is to pick your fights, right? And I think the fights that have been chosen collectively in D.C. by some of the folks here, some of the folks out there, have been the F-35s, the S-400s, the CATSA sanctions, the drones that were used against Armenians in Artsakh, right? You got to pick the battle. The Gray Wolves, the NDAA bill that's up before the House hopefully later today will decide whether or not the House sees the Gray Wolves as a terrorist organization. But I'll just stick to the drones, for example, right? Turkey exported or deployed, sold, gave, whatever, gifted drones to Azerbaijan, very advanced, which they used against Armenians in Artsakh. Turns out some were shot down. They opened them up, found at least 10 U.S. parts. They found some Canadian parts. The Canadians blocked all export licenses, which is a good thing. The U.S. hasn't done that yet. But Undersecretary Nuland was asked about it during her hearing before the Foreign Relations Committee. 28 U.S. legislators wrote to Secretary Blinken about it. It is the subject also of an NDA amendment. I believe this is one other thing. Yeah, that's it. NDA, letter, Nuland. Also, there's a letter that IDC and the ANC joined with other groups in writing to SpaceX. I know Dr. Rubin has written about this. SpaceX, ask SpaceX, better question, ask the FAA, why are you launching Turkish satellites that will surely come back to bite us? So, and these are battles that you win or you lose, but at the very least, the battles that can be fought. And I think that's kind of where we are today, which is we're vastly better off than we were 5, 10, 20 years ago. We're now, as I said, in the field of politics, which means you win some, you lose some. We're not, Turkey doesn't, because they don't get everything they want, doesn't mean they get none of what they want. And they have good resources. I saw the very, very kind readout of yesterday's meeting between the foreign ministers meeting, and it was like a, emphasize Turkey's important role as a NATO ally. So there's going to be a little back and forth, but ultimately the arc of it, I think, will move in our direction. So I think we're moving in the right direction. Just going to take a lot of work. There are limits. I'm very much. Andrew made a very good point about the limits of folks in that part of the world waiting for Western salvation. That's really, really good advice. Literally 100 years ago, President Wilson sent, and I'll wrap up with this. 100 years ago, President Wilson sent a commission to the region. It was named after the leader of the commission, named General Harbord. And he was asked, what should be the U.S. engagement with the Christians of that part of the world, with the Armenians? And he wrote a report for the president in which, by and large, he argued against U.S. engagement. Made some good points for it, but ultimately argued against it, just saying it's a bridge too far, supply lines, U.S. Sustainable interest, all these various reasons. He's like, yeah, we're probably not going to do that. And that, what he wrote about a century ago, pretty much applies today. So I think we have to be very, very realistic about where we can make change, and that might be the NDAA, SpaceX, drones, CATSA, F-35s, things like that. It's going to be incremental. It's not going to be a fundamental reorientation of policy. No one's, as much as they talk about it, I don't think there's any expulsion of Turkey from NATO anytime soon. So, but I think we can aspire toward a more reasonable, responsible relationship with Turkey, and I would just leave it at that. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Ram. I'd like to shift over to Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin, we've for a long time followed your very prolific work writing on Turkey. So for that reason, I don't want to bound your talk with a bound question. So I just throw it over to you to provide your geostrategic outlook on Turkey.
When I look at Washington, and when it comes to issues relating to Turkey, and when it comes to issues relating to persecution against Christians, I see two main problems. Number one is, as Aram has stated, the very short sense of history which Washington has. And the second is the tendency within America's bureaucracy to stovepipe. First, let's talk about history. I didn't know it at the time, but I ended up being one of the last non-Armenian Americans to be able to go to Artsakh just short of a year ago. And I had no concept when I went that the surprise attack that was launched had coincided with the 100th anniversary of the Turkish invasion, the Ottoman invasion of the independent Republic of Armenia. Certainly, this wasn't a coincidence. And understanding that certainly gave a much broader context, especially when we then subsequently heard both Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Ilham Aliyev's Islamist rhetoric with regard to armies of Muhammad and so forth. And the only conclusion that could be drawn then is that the ideology of genocide didn't disappear with the end of the genocide which the Biden administration formally recognized, only to then walk back literally the next day with regard to issuing once again the waiver of Section 907. It makes very clear that while in Turkey, and specifically with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, where there is a long arc of history, where there is a long understanding of this, that the United States' short-sightedness truly undermined our ability to analyze where the region was going and what is at stake. the concept, the short-term memory syndrome which the United States has also applies to international law. I had always been taught, including when I was in ARTSOC itself, that the United States recognized not only the disputed districts, but also Nagorno-Karabakh itself as Azerbaijani. However, and certainly this is the case within the State Department, where people rotate for 2 years at a time and simply inherit the conventional wisdom which was left to them by their predecessor, and they have no idea where such conventional wisdom generates. However, if we look not 100 years ago, but just 30 years ago, to Azerbaijan's re-independence from the Soviet Union, we see Azerbaijan basing its independence and its claim to statehood and its legitimacy on the first Republic of Azerbaijan rather than Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic, which means, according to Azerbaijan itself, Nagorno-Karabakh isn't necessarily Azerbaijani. There's no reason why the United States needs to blindly accept the gerrymandering that was put in place by Joseph Stalin. Although, to give the State Department benefit of the doubt, any of the 20-somethings or 30-somethings who are manning the desks have absolutely no idea that that is exactly what they're doing, or about how Azerbaijan justified its own independence back in 1991. And so this is just an indication of the broad sweep of history. But Aram also talked rightly about the drones and the deadly impact which not only the Turkish drones, but shamefully the Israeli drones had in Artsakh, in this surprise attack that coincided with the anniversary of the Ottoman invasion of Armenia. The fact of the matter is, however, that Artsakh isn't alone. Consider Tigray right now, where it appears that Recep Tayyip Erdogan is willing to provide drones to the Ethiopian government to pursue what very much appears to be a genocide or the preparation for genocide against Tigrayan Christians. Ethiopian diplomats might haughtily reject such a notion, but just a rule of thumb is if you don't allow aid to go someplace, and if you don't allow diplomats to go someplace, as Amy talked about when it came to the location of the original Armenian genocide, some parts of the original Armenian genocide, and then ongoing Turkish operations, chances are you have something to hide. And that's certainly the case when it comes to Tigray. It's certainly the case when it comes to Abiy Ahmed, who will become the Norwegian Nobel Committee's most embarrassing laureate in its history. I have no doubt. But beyond that, we have the issue of Turkish drones going elsewhere. I mean, a drone base which is being opened or has been opened in occupied Cyprus. And all of this suggests that there is a pattern here which can't be fully appreciated if we only look at one country, another country, and look at this through the pipelines. And I'm not accusing In Defense of Christians of doing this. Certainly, Greeks, Armenians and their various organizations, Kurds, Jews, and so forth are working together and coordinating information in a way which is much more proactive, much more broad-minded than our own State Department and US government is doing, in which we have situations where what happens in Cyprus, what happens in Ethiopia, what happens in Artsakh are considered three very different issues with diplomats that seldom talk to each other. So let me just conclude by highlighting those issues, that it is essential that the United States and American diplomats grow to have a much broader sense of history. Ancient history did not start 10 years ago. That's recent history. Nor do any US administrations, no matter how reprehensible one finds the previous administration, ever start with a tabula rasa when it comes to policy. We need a much broader perspective. We need to educate ourselves much better. And that is one of the reasons why I'm so glad that I've become acquainted with the work of IDC, which, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Armenia, whether it's in Cyprus and so forth, is at the forefront of this truly important education mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. I'd like to shift now to Dr. Irdemir. Very similar to Dr. Rubin, I don't want to bound your comments, so the floor is yours.
I would like to start by thanking IDC for holding this panel and inviting me. And I would like to have a more forward-looking set of comments about what the latest trends are concerning the persecution of ethnic and religious minorities in Turkey, and what can be done in terms of a policy response. First of all, to set the trends, let me begin by arguing that as of last year, we are in terra incognito. We are in a completely new playing field, although this is not the view from the State Department or from Washington. Most observers take a look at Erdogan's decisions to convert Hagia Sophia and Kora and think that, okay, it's a symbolic conversion that mainly aims at the domestic audiences, and ultimately, you know, most within the EU and the US chose to look the other way, or chose to accept it. But ultimately, I think what people have missed is that those conversions and the language, the policy rhetoric that accompanied them have fundamentally changed the nature of belonging, the nature of citizenship within Turkey. One framing that the Turkish government used to justify the conversions was the right of the sword. So they were making a reference to a 15th century conquest and conversion law as justification of a 22nd century policy within the secular Republic of Turkey. So that decision and rhetoric, I would argue, have fundamentally changed the nature of the Turkish Republic, relegated Turkey's religious minorities from de jure equal but de facto unequal citizens to de jure and de facto subjugated slaves or subjects. Basically, they are now dominated subjects of a sectarian and unequal regime. Second, by senior Turkish officials, references to remnants of the sword or the Byzantines among us. By the way, the first one is a pejorative term to refer to genocide survivors, and the latter is, again, a pejorative term to refer to, when you think about Byzantines, as not just being Greek Orthodox, but as kind of the pre-Ottoman non-Muslim heritage of Anatolia, of Asia Minor. That too, I think, fundamentally reframes the belonging, the legal and practical belonging of non-Muslims to the Turkish polity at hand. So that is, I think, a big deal, and Turkey watchers should have made a bigger deal out of it. Now, the key trends based on this that I see as worrying trends are, we are transitioning to an era of captured communities. I characterize what came before as excluded communities, discriminated against communities, targeted communities. But captured communities, in my mind, represents a more advanced form of discrimination and subjugation. In that, these communities are now asked to be active agents in their own subjugation and accomplices in the whitewashing of the Erdogan regime's atrocities. And what I mean by that is the leadership, both religious and lay leadership of Turkey's non-Muslim communities, are now expected to be willing and able players in whitewashing the regime's persecution and crimes. How, you might wonder? First of all, through spectacles of tolerance. And what I mean by that is they now have to attend ceremonies or sign statements or play props in various window dressing attempts to show that the Erdogan government is tolerant, benevolent, and embracing of minorities. And this could simply be a letter, and these are all real cases, a letter forced on Turkey's religious minorities, where they state that there is no pressure on religious minorities in Turkey. Or this could be a letter for them to express their support of Turkish cross-border military operations in northern Syria. Or this could simply be a request to perform certain religious ceremonies at highly publicized spectacle events. Just to give you an example, when Turkey received flack for converting Hagia Sophia, Ankara demanded Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew to attend in person at the height of the COVID pandemic a ceremony, a liturgy at the Sümele Monastery. Because the Turkish government, after a 5-year hiatus, wanted to reopen the monastery and hold liturgy one day a year to showcase its tolerant treatment of Christians, and particularly the Greek leaders who are hostage and almost at gunpoint, symbolically, after threats, to partake in such spectacles of tolerance. Here, the responsibility is on the Erdogan government. I think both US and European audiences need to make it very clear to Ankara that they don't want these spectacles of tolerance, they will not partake in them, and they do not want to be willing participants in these photo op stunts. The second issue, again, a major new trend, is that religious minorities who vote with their feet, which basically means they disappear demographically from Turkey for good. Turkey's Greek Orthodox are now less than 2,000, possibly closer to 1,500, almost all above 60 years of age. Turkey's Jewish community is now below 17,000. So minorities are going extinct in Turkey. They're voting with their feet, as some of my non-Muslim Turkish colleagues here in the US tell me. They have left not because they fear the government themselves personally, they could have endured the hardships, but they said for our children, so that they can have a future. But at the same time, the Turkish government makes sure that while the religious minority communities disappear, there is a flourishing of museums, churches and synagogues that do not serve as worship halls, as houses of worship, but as tourism spectacles, as museums that the government restores and manages, and then maybe one day a year allows religious ceremonies, but uses 365 days a year to showcase the government's tolerance and benevolence as talking points, as props, as window dressing attempts. So again, I think it's important that Turkey's Western counterparts do not partake in such whitewashing ceremonies at such sites and give legitimacy and credibility to the Erdogan government's stance. Now, how about policy? And let me end with some policy suggestions. What is to be done? You know, because this campaign will only get more intense. And I'm not going into a third important trend, and that is extraterritorialization of Turkey's persecution. Because until recently, most of the problem had to do with minorities within Turkey. But now, through proxies, as well as cross-border operations, now religious minorities also feel the Erdogan government's wrath beyond Turkey's borders. And my colleague Amy has done a great job talking about that. But let me go into the policy aspect. So what can be done as we have these new strategies of persecution and domination of ethnic and religious minorities? First of all, I think there is really an important role the US Commission on International Religious Freedom and the State Department can play. You know, USERF has been recommending Turkey to be designated a second-tier country for years. Now it's called the Special Watch List country. This is the second tier after a CPC designation, a country of particular concern designation. Certainly with the conversion of Hagia Sophia, I think Turkey merits a CPC designation. So I think it is time for USERF to start recommending Turkey to be designated as a CPC country. But more importantly, I think the State Department needs to take the first step by not looking the other way when it comes to a special watch list designation. Because so far, the State Department, with the exception of a year, I think 2013 possibly, looked the other way. I think this year should be the year when finally, and I don't have any hopes, especially given now how Erdogan has leveraged Afghanistan, to force the Biden administration as well as Brussels to appease Ankara. But nevertheless, I think the State Department should do the moral thing and follow USERF's designation. But beyond that, I think there should be a concerted transatlantic effort to demand Ankara, first and foremost, to grant legal status, legal persona to all religious communities in Turkey so that they can enter into legal transactions and own and utilize property. Turkey should stop interfering in the election of religious leaders of minority communities. We have seen such attempts with the Armenian patriarch election. Turkey should stop interfering in religious minorities' attempts to train their own clergy and, for example, reopen the Halki Seminary. And finally, the Erdogan government needs to end state-sponsored and sanctioned propagation of hate and conspiracies against religious minorities, which make them victims of hate crimes and hate speech, and which make them even more reliant on the benevolence and the good graces of the Erdogan government for protection. And let me end my talk with a call to you all. It is really important to work with allies within Turkey and outside Turkey among the Turkish diaspora. And one thing you can start doing today is to show that you are in solidarity with Turkey's leading minority rights advocate and human rights advocate, Osman Kavala, who has been in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison for over 3 years for no other reason than to defend the rights and freedoms of every single ethnic and religious minority in Turkey, for advocating for Turkish-Armenian, Turkish-Greek reconciliation, for documenting and restoring Turkey's religious minority heritage. And instead of getting a medal from the Turkish government, his life has been destroyed. This is a person who is Turkey's leading philanthropist who devoted his entire life, energy, and wealth to upholding Turkey's pluralistic heritage and future. So I think it's really important at a time when the State Department and the Biden administration have dropped the ball on Turkey and human rights, that we stand in solidarity with Osman Kavala and the like in and beyond Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Icon. I'd like to shift finally over to our friend Andy, who's joining us virtually from Chicago. Andy, as we know just by being spectators of Turkey, there's been a lot of activity as of recent in Cyprus. Just last month, Erdogan was in Cyprus grandstanding what essentially is tantamount to the Turkish annexation in northern Cyprus. Shortly thereafter, last week or two, you were actually out there with a congressional delegation led by Senator Menendez in Greece and in Cyprus particularly. Andy, what did you take away from that visit, and what's next for the U.S. government in your perspective?
Sure, and thank you. First of all, thank you to the IDC for all its work, not only today but over years. And I want to start off like in the spirit of the approaching baseball playoffs. My colleagues loaded the bases, so I have to knock in the runs. But if there is one takeaway, I want to echo what Icon said. Osman Kavala, that should be, and he represents so much more. He represents everything Icon said, but also represents how bold and Erdogan feels that he's never going to be held accountable, not for anything. Kavala's case is closely tied with Henri Barkey. If I could go on and I could spend the whole panel talking about the threats that Icon and Michael have gotten, or even for the given our advocacy on the drones, and Turkey's putting out paid former agents in the state, well, current agents, but former State Department officials like Matt Breiser to call Aram an extremist. This is a regime that has physically assaulted Americans on American soil. So let's not forget that and by the way, they conducted the farce of having a parliamentary delegation minus HDP, which are trying to ban, come and visit the Congress. So let's remember who we're talking about, that it's not only interest, there's a value proposition here. Cyprus is a little bit of a microcosm of all the issues we're talking about. Go again to talk about Turkish activists, true Democrats, secularists, human rights, whatever anybody wants to label them. Think about that Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, minus Turkey, left out of the picture. If Erdogan was out of the picture, could probably reunite Cyprus. And Erdogan saw that as a threat and got involved, and Icon has written about this extensively, and rigged the last election so Akinci would lose, and you have a hardliner, Tatar, who want to upend stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. When it comes to religious freedom, and again, following up on the point about the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, they, starting back in 2012, in the Turkey chapter, were talking about what Turkey is doing to churches and to Christian heritage and to Christian worship in occupied Cyprus. Turkey really raised a tremendous stink about their occupation activities being put in the Turkey chapter in the Yusuf report. Unfortunately, both Yusuf and State Department have stopped reporting on those activities in that report of late. But if you saw what they did with historic churches in Cyprus, and let's remember the first Christian mission was in Cyprus, St. Paul and Barnabas. Lazarus is buried in Cyprus. You have Armenian churches, Maronite. This is not just a Greek Orthodox. Cyprus holds a historic place in worldwide Christianity. But if you saw what they did to historic churches in Cyprus, turning some into stables and barns and discotheques, you would not have been surprised at what they're trying to do with Hora and Hagia Sophia. This is really a matter of ending Turkish impunity. And there are ways to do it. Using the CPC, country of particular concern designation, is exactly right on. And let's go back to the Hagia Sophia example. Vice President Pence tweeted about it. Secretary Pompeo tweeted about it. Then candidate Biden did a whole statement about it. And then everybody forgot about it. Even though UNESCO is saying Turkey has not told us how they're preserving the Christian heritage of Hagia Sophia. Erdogan has an unfortunate habit of dealing with crises by creating more crises. And we take our eye off the ball, and the State Department is taking their eye off the ball. And despite the Biden administration, I think, starting strong, I echo Icon's fear of an accommodationist streak coming up because of Afghanistan. And this is an accommodationist streak that we don't have to have. Alternatives have developed that weren't there when the people who are in the Biden administration were last in government. You have a spirit of cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean that back in 2015, people were doubting its lasting power. But if you look at the trilateral between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which also includes Egypt and Jordan and France and Italy, if you look at the trilateral working with the Abraham Accord countries, the cooperation between Greece, Cyprus, and Armenia, India now developing relationships in the region. There are alternatives to Turkey, and this is a way for the U.S. to signal if Turkey doesn't turn west. I'm not making a call to abandon Turkey, because we're going to abandon the very activists that Icon said that we should stick up for. But we have to empower them, because letting Erdogan continue with impunity is warping Turkish politics to the point that the day after Erdogan may not be any better. We have to, there are people, apologists, some who serve on the National Security Council right now, who say, well, don't abandon Turkey, we have to play for the day after Erdogan. Yeah, but we have to make sure that the pro-Western forces, the forces of tolerance of a Turkey that's tolerant and open to all its citizens, and it is not using the captive communities. That's so important, because that capture, as Icon noted, does not extend. It is not limited to the borders of Turkey. We saw it this week in New York. We saw it this week in New York, where, because he's part of a captive community, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop of America went to the opening of the new Turkish building in New York with Erdogan, with Çavuşoğlu, with the leader of the Diyanet, who opened or reconverted Hagia Sophia with the sword at his side, and with the Turkish Cypriot leader, who's calling for two states and not recognizing Greek Cypriots and all the rest. So we have to call them out when we have to have an absolute, this is on Capitol Hill Day. I can leave you with one message. Congress really led the charge in changing and starting to change U.S. policy, but we should put the congressional feet to the fire on, you know what, if another congressional parliamentary delegation shows up with the HDP, we're not taking the meetings. We're going to talk about Osman Kavala. We have to make sure, we have to make sure there are consequences for the Sheridan Circle attacks. And that's just a beginning.
Thank you so much for that, Andy. We appreciate that. Unfortunately, we've run to the end of our time. I scanned through some of the online questions that we've been receiving throughout the talk, and it just so happens that all of the questions have been, in fact, answered very nicely by our experts today, so that just speaks to their expertise that much more. I'd like to give our audience here live an opportunity, if they do have any questions, I see Isaac. Yes. Just one moment. The mic is coming to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for your remarks. Isaac Woodward from the Philos Project. This question is about basically Armenia and Armenia's diaspora and their choice for kind of a champion in this new era that's existing, the choice of Russia as the bulwark of Eastern Christendom versus the U.S. I think I and others I know were disappointed with the results of the ceasefire last year, what actually happened, and the Russians being the brokers. Questions about if they're actually going to hold Azerbaijan effectively to some of those points that they were set to, for example, actually returning the remains and prisoners of war from the conflict, I don't think has been fully satisfied yet. So I wanted to see if you could speak to that relationship between Armenia, it's looking maybe to the west, to the U.S. as someone to protect its interests versus Russia, and how that influences the Turkey situation. It's obviously a complex mess there.
This sounds like a good one for Ron, but I just ask for brevity but completeness.
Okay. Yeah, Armenia's in a tough neighborhood and has had a tough history. And as the word complementarity has been used sometimes to define Armenian foreign policy, where Armenia tends to look sort of to different vectors for different things. So given the history, given the neighborhood, more for security to the north, maybe more political engagement with Europe, reform to the U.S. So it's like we try to, Armenians, I'm speaking as an Armenian American, but Armenia as a republic seeks by and large to balance the various neighbors, to balance the various interests in the world in as healthy a way as possible. I think the game in the Caucasus is to survive, right? And Armenia right now needs to survive. And to survive needs good relationships with the U.S., good relationships with Europe, good relationships with Europe, and with as many neighbors as will have good relations with it. As it turns out, our Turkish Nazi neighbors are not interested in that. But I think it's a balancing act, and one that Armenia has tried to do for centuries. I'll defer to Dr. Rubin in just a second, but I teach Sunday school, and that's one of the classes I teach, is how Armenians have so often through history found themselves straddling different empires and different competing interests. And one day, if you come visit me at Sunday school, I'll give you the longer version. Thanks.
I'd like to give it to Michael for about 1 minute.
Very, very quickly, as a non-Armenian and as someone who in the past has been critical of Armenia's foreign policy orientation, let me put it this way. It's unfair for the United States to criticize Armenian ties with Russia so long as the double embargo on Armenia exists. But more broadly, the Armenian diaspora is large in Russia, in the United States, in Iran, and in the United Kingdom. So rather than look at this as a liability, Armenia is actually well situated, especially now that its elections are behind it, to really be the place, the diplomatic focal point, not just for issues relating to the South Caucasus, but far beyond. And it's time, I would argue, that Armenians and Armenia start pitching itself in that way, as the diplomatic focal point that has the connections that no one else does.
Thank you so much, Michael and Iran, both. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. I invite you all, I mean, our experts will be here hanging around, so we can definitely take part in conversation after we're through. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. A special thanks to our participants, you all here in person, as well as the folks at home joining us virtually. And with that, that concludes the first portion of IDC Capitol Hill Advocacy Day. We'll take about 1 hour break and resume at 12 noon Eastern Time by reporting to your pre-assigned groups to meet with Congress. I encourage you to advocate hard and remember who we are fighting for and who we serve. You're all doing God's work here on earth. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and please have a wonderful day. And one final housekeeping note, please. One final housekeeping note for the folks here today in person. Following your congressional meetings this afternoon, you're all invited right back here to join us at 5 p.m. or whenever you're through. No, please don't rush. To join us here for a social event, light snacks, drinks, and that sort of thing. Again, advocate hard. You know, if you have meetings that run long, we'll be here, no worries. But we look forward to hearing your stories from your advocacy today. Thank you. Thank you.